pronouns and stuff. Also, I'll be timing you if you want. And without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister.
This is good for you. Let me turn down my phone. Is the volume okay? Can everyone hear me? Alright,
I can hear you.
That's good. Maybe. Okay. Are you ready? Starting in 3, 2, 1. We believe that when archaic works being introduced into the education system of children, this allows them from fundamentally being able to actualize and learn to the fullest extent the English language while coming with the harms of propagating notions like the lack of inclusivity and diversity, as well as boring these students out of their minds. We think this is incredibly harmful. We don't want this world. A few things before I get into my lines of argumentation. First, what will our side and side proposition look like? So in our side of the house, we would teach contemporary works. What does this mean? In our side of the house, when you come to the standard of English, when you look at literature, when you look at when your English teacher wants to give you a book to go home and do your book study and research about what the author really means, we think we'll be giving you more contemporary works that are more relevant to the time period. This looks like books by J.K. Rowling like Harry Potter, or even like social activism works like The Hate You Give or Love, Simon. We are incredibly fine with the retelling of classic works using different lens. This looks like books like These Violent Delights, which are basically a retelling of Romeo and Juliet by the form of a feminist protagonist standpoint, or The Song of Achilles, which is a retelling of the Iliad through a largely homosexual and a very inclusivity when it comes to gender ability. We are fine with the retelling of works that use these new and improved social lenses. We think on outside the house there's no absence of this work because there are other metrics that keep classics alive. Therefore, Ob cannot come out and say that these classics will die out because there are multiple other metrics in society in order to keep them alive. This looks like, in the base sense, like museums, even as Shakespeare Day that has them. And we look at modern day book clubs and book societies that work to keep the preservation of these classics alive. We think these classics will still stay in relevance and will still be able to be appreciated by the masses. However, we just don't believe that students should be ones who study these archaic texts and these texts who are incredibly outdated when it comes to their message and their storyline. We think this is not something we want everyday high school students or everyday even college students to look into in their daily life. Kinds of argumentation. First, why contemporary inclusivity is principally justified in contemporary works, and secondly, how this allows a much larger buy-in from students. So first, why is contemporary inclusivity principally justified? We have to look at the purpose, the fundamental purpose of an English class in high school. An English class in high school is to teach said language as a form of expressive communication in today's society. Note that language is an incredibly powerful metric in which you can use to do almost anything in status quo. Speeches, letters, and books can shape the very fundamental basis of society. Language is a form of powerful rhetoric that can literally move mountains. This is why we teach it in class. We teach it in school so individuals have the ability to express themselves, to express all their ideas, their opinions, and how they think in society towards their friends, family, and even strangers through this form of empowering communication. Furthermore, when you look at an English class and you look at literature, we think this is a way for individuals to find new aspects of themselves, to discover themselves in new and interesting ways by looking at newer books. This allows the literary aspect of an English class allows for a better worldview and internalization of society because individuals, when they pick up new books, when they really delve into the world that the book is trying to give to them, are able to better self-internalize, are able to better appreciate society around them when they dive into books that carry pertinent messages, important societal benefits that are relevant in today's day and age. Secondly, why contemporary works are the only metric which fulfills this criteria. This is because classics are outdated and do not show any appropriate representation of society today. Works based in the 1600s from Shakespeare or even the 1800s from Jane Austen do not directly reflect what the world looks like in today's day and age. Therefore, individuals who buy into these, who have to read this just for a school project, this allows them from actually knowing what society really looks like based off these books. In the comparison, in outside the house, we allow for better representation of society to contemporary actions that show the world as it really is, not as it was 200 years ago, and tells individuals that these are still relevant, these languages are still relevant, this culture is still relevant for you today. The canonization of these classics has to be recognized as something that was incredibly elitist and inherently privileged from the get-go. When the Western canon was established in the 1900s, it was established by a bunch of old white dudes who decided, hey, these are the books that we think is the most important in society today, and therefore should be studied as a whole. Not that the Western canon is inherently discriminatory in the form that it doesn't allow for a lot of other representation, in fact, not just in forms of protagonists or the main character of books, but even in forms of authors. Contemporary works allows for a more diverse view in terms of many different types of society. It looks like a more diverse author spectrum where you have authors of color, where you have authors of a different sexual orientation writing books. This looks like protagonists. When you see protagonists of color, you see like a proper representation of a female. You see protagonists who are sexually orientated different. And you look at different settings that are not just a whitewashed culture. We think these are only represented in contemporary books. Classical books simply just do not have these forms of settings. Finally, how classical works are fundamentally unrelatable because they don't allow for the same metrics of diversity and representation that contemporary works gives you. It's incredibly constrained in the way that they depict the world as a whole, which is they bottleneck an individual's ability to properly analyze what things were back then or what things were during that time, because they constrain you to a certain standard of what the society looks like. This lack of perspective in classics directly hampers an individual to learn and to have self-fulfillment that comes from literature. The fundamental of what the language is supposed to bring you during the time where you have consumed this literature, it inhibits your ability to properly learn and properly enable for you to look at society in a diverse way through literature. We think this is something that's only available to contemporary. Before I go on, any POIs? No? Okay. Sure.
So I was just gonna ask, why do you think that the purpose of English class should be to like let people know about society when there are literally social studies classes and history classes that specifically deal with this issue?
Social studies and history classes deal with other aspects of society when you view it as a whole. In English class, you are able to view society through the lens of another individual, through the direct words and the written thing from their mouth. It allows them to view different perspectives, therefore allows you to view society in an inherently different way. However, we say that the way that these classical works allow you to view society is incredibly harmful. Secondly, how it allows for larger buy-in for students. First, it allows for greater amounts of relatability. So we get better representation and actualization on the outside of the house because we put forward contemporary works. It allows for individuals to further relate for protagonists and deals with issues that are now very pertinent in society. And for we don't see Shakespeare talking about mental health issues, depression, and bullying when you look at his plays of Macbeth or Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet. However, you see these kinds of things in contemporary works. When you look at Harry Potter, when you look at The Hate You Give, when you look at all the boys I've loved, you can see a lot of these societal metrics that only occur in today's world. Reading is far more relatable when you read a book about a high school setting with mental health issues or depressions versus an old Scottish king fighting ghosts in a moving forest in order to keep his throne. I think our side is much more compelling and allows for greater relatability for students. Secondly, how classics just perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Archaic social structures, like the objectification of women in Taming of the Shrew, or the anti-Semitic notions of Merchant of Venice, is something that's being propagated by allowing students to read this classical work. Bob has to defend the reintroduction and propagation of same notions in the education system, something that society has worked so hard in the past decade or so in order to quash these forms of oppression and stigma. For all same reasons, side-to-side proposition if you want proper education to take place. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Now I call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Ready when you are.
Thank you. I think the entire basis of government's arguments rely upon the fact that they think English class is somehow for teaching about society, for teaching about what society is today. My main challenge to that is that English class in high school should not be teaching about that. And I think there's one core reason why, right? Because that's not the real purpose of English class. Expressing themselves and learning about society is for classes like social studies or history, where the purpose is actually for studying things like society, what society is today. There are other classes like counseling core, which let these individuals discover their own identities. We don't think English class is uniquely specific to teach these individuals about what's happening in society today. Rather, on opposition, what do you think the actual definition and actual purpose of an English class is? The purpose of English classes in high school, right? Is that in high school is to develop your analysis and English skills even further. Because notice that in middle school and elementary, you'll probably already be exposed to the basics of English, how to write a decent essay, and so on. So now the focus on English class is analysis and synthesis, as these are the main English skills that high schools and college classes stress. Don't believe their illusion about English, about trying to teach you about society. That is completely false in today's world. So what's our stance on opposition? Our stance is we will defend the classics from authors like William Shakespeare, but other than that, we will also defend classics from around the world. For example, the translated poems by Li Bai in China, and so on. This will guarantee that we will not have an impressive and discriminatory Eurocentric works in the English classrooms. But then with all that, what was the main point that they bring you? The main point was that classics do not show any appropriate representation in society today. We completely concede that point, but I don't really think that point matters in today's debate, right? Because notice that is not the purpose of English class, and as said before, things like social studies who will teach these people about activism movements, things like social studies who will teach people that discriminating women is wrong, is completely relevant in society and in schools already. But then secondly, even if social studies isn't enough for these students, we're also completely happy with these English teachers telling their students that these works are not an accurate representation of society, that they're only studying these works for its literary value, not really its representation of society. I think their entire case gets taken down once I prove to you that the definition is false in of itself. So what are the two substantive arguments that you'll get from opposition? I'll give you two, which is that firstly, classics actually make better students and make better teaching material. And secondly, how there's actually a negative trade-off if you teach contemporary works. But firstly, on how classics make better students. I think firstly, we need a comparison between a classic work and a contemporary work, which government does not give you. And I think there's two reasons why classic work is way better than things such as Harry Potter, which is that firstly, contemporary works are not popular because of their actual literary devices that the author uses, but are rather popular because of their content. Harry Potter is probably one of the most popular series in today's world. However, we never see anybody praising it for its literary techniques and deep meanings inside the text. What Harry Potter is praised for, however, is its content and storytelling ability. So its purpose is not for students to learn, but rather to entertain. That is the entire purpose of the series today. On the comparative, literary works like Shakespeare are famous because they are complex, because there are so many literary devices involved with it. This is the first reason as to why classic works are better than the contemporary one, being that they have just more literary value as a whole. But is that contemporary works hasn't endured the constant continuous testing throughout the generations. Look at Shakespeare. His works have been analyzed and interpreted for many generations, almost 500 years. Yet, they still continue to find the same level of popularity, they still continue to find the same level of meaning, and are still as popular in society today. What this means is that we have a guarantee that works by Dickinson, that works by Shakespeare, will have enough informational and literary value because it has been tested for many years before. However, we have no guarantee for books like Harry Potter, which have only existed for like 10 years. We have no guarantee that there's actual educational value in this book. This is the second reason why contemporary works are worse than classic works, because they have been tested throughout the years. With that being said, why then do these classics actually make students better? And they are better for the classroom for mainly two reasons as well. Which is that firstly, the writing prose inside of the classic work is better. Because notice that for books like Harry Potter, the literary devices are non-existent because they want the book to be accepted and understood for a wide population. They want the book's own purpose to be entertainment, not actual educational. This is not the case for Steinberg or Shakespeare, where there are huge amounts of literary value in their works. I think this is pretty agreeable for both sides in today's debate. What this means is that students are actually better able to learn because there's just more learning value in these classic works compared to contemporary ones. But then secondly, and even more importantly, is that these classic works have been taught and reviewed by past generations. Because notice that in many cases, teachers' classes become better and better after experience. This means that in many cases, teachers teach better when they know the mistakes that have made in the previous classes. This is the reason why the first class for every teacher is often referred to as the guinea pig, because that class is essentially the experiment the experiment for the teacher to recognize what they should teach for their later classes. This then translates into today's debate, right? Because notice that classes have been taught by schools for hundreds of years. So teachers already have the experience and know how to teach these classes. On the comparative, for contemporary works, it hasn't been taught before and has not been taught for a long time. So the experience that teachers have isn't as much. The quality of teaching goes down once you introduce contemporary works into the classroom. Therefore, the general impact of this first argument is that students actually perform better and learn more if they learn about classics rather than contemporary works, because firstly, there's more literary value in these classics, but secondly, teachers can teach better if they are teaching these classic works. Before I move on to my second argument, I'll take your point.
It is disingenuous to just say there are no literary devices such as foreshadowing societal representation within books. But then you just have to tell us, why is it important to know all these literary devices? Why is analyzing a sentence important for a student?
Because that's what you need in order to get to college. Because the process of high school, I've already said before in my introduction, if you were listening, is that the purpose of a high school English classroom is to further your understanding and further your synthesis of English devices. And in many universities, they require you to be able to actually adequately analyze classic text. So I think the introduction of these in high school is extremely important. But then the second part of a rebuttal, right? Why do these contemporary works don't have as much literary devices? Well, the main reason that I've already explicitly stated is that they are meant for entertainment. They're not meant for any educational value. The only purpose of being there is to sell more books. So there won't be literary devices because these literary devices won't be understood by the wide majority of the population, which is their incentive for keeping the book simple, which is their incentive for keeping the book's only value its storytelling techniques. But then moving on to my second argument, why there's a negative trade-off. Because there's no need for these students to learn about these contemporary works anyways. Notice that these works are thought of to be contemporary because they are popular, which means that many students have read about these works in the first place. I can guarantee you that if you ask high school students whether or not they have read Harry Potter, at least 80% of them will say they have. So then what are the harms of this then when you still teach these contemporary works? Which is that firstly, it's going to be a waste of time for students that have read Harry Potter or these contemporary works. Because notice that in a current class curriculum, the teacher still needs to go over the basics about Harry Potter. They still need to stick to the same curriculum. However, for the individuals that have read the book, they already have information beforehand, so they're basically going to an English class and wasting their time. But then secondly, for the students that have not read the contemporary, they would then be dragged down. Because notice that it's an either or. The teacher has to choose which group to focus on, either the people that have read the book or the people that haven't. However, on both of these scenarios, it doesn't matter which group the teacher chooses to focus on, one group will always get harmed. If the teacher decides to focus on the group that read the book, the group that did not read the book will get dragged down because the class curriculum is too advanced for them. If the teacher decides to start with basics and focus on the group that hasn't read, the people that have already read the book are wasting their time in the English classroom. So on the comparative, Shakespeare classes are extremely difficult to read, which means you won't just pick up a book for fun when you're in middle school because they're so complex. But secondly, these classes are also extremely hard to read, meaning that you will not read it when you're young because you'll probably not be able to understand it. This means that there's going to be better teaching on opposition side because every student is being introduced to something new and starting the learning at the same level if you do introduce classic literary works. The main impact of this is that there is a better classroom environment and equal teaching for every student. Students are able to get a better quality of teaching if you start with classics. So for those two reasons, I think we clearly take this debate extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank the DLO for that speech. Now I call upon the LO for that speech. Now I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Hi, am I audible?
Are ready when you are.
Okay. In an English class, when I receive the list of books I need to read to complete my term, understand that I do not only read the lines of words that are strung together to make the book sound beautiful. I do not only just read a single paragraph, nor do I only just read a huge conglomeration of literary devices. Understand when students read books that are presented in the list that are required of them in an English class, they are reading about the world through a specific lens of an author. They are reading about the moral compasses and values that this author valued in his or her lifetime and in his or her time period. Therefore, we think that this debate cannot only be about whether or not these classics are the best tool in furthering the purposes of English classes, but also because of the fact that books and works can never be isolated from the very fundamentals of shaping how a student views the world in the future. We think this also should be an incredibly important discussion in today's debate. First of all, opposition came up and told us, and they questioned us that and about how English classes should not be used as a medium for social issues because they exist other mediums such as history classes and social issue classes, right? First of all, understand as how I've already told you, books and works can never be isolated on how they influence the way the student sees the world. Because we think that more often than not, the sort of books that you're exposed to at an early age, especially when you're going through your entire period of growing up, we think you are not only it doesn't only influence the language, the level of your English proficiency or how well you're able to then string words together or write better essays. We think that these sort of works that you're exposed to in a long period of time during your high school period from 6 to 7 years is ultimately going to affect the way you view society. And because of the fact that it's going to then affect the way you view society, we think then that students should not only read words from a specific perspective of a writer that was deemed to be morally right in his time frame or in his time period, right? Understand that opposition does not engage in a lot of analysis that comes from Wesley on how he told you that classics often date back way into the past and how more often than not the sort of moral values that are encompassed within those classics do not reflect the sort of norms that are being practiced in the world right now, right? Because the second thing that opposition then talks about is that how they're also going to include a large variety of classics from all around the world within their curriculum. Understand that there are a few flaws of this because of the fact that the very reason and the very method on how these books were then classified to be classics in the first place is because they were picked by specific scholars and specific writers, and they were picked together to form a literary canon, right? Understand that this literary canon then has historically been dictated to be extremely traditional and extremely conservative. That is to say that the sort of works that are more often not to be deemed as a classic and labeled as a classic in the first place are often works that are written by socially privileged white men, right? We think that this is an example of how it is extremely exclusive and how like your works, even though you're going to include classics from all around the world, will also continue to be classics. Because just because you pick a classic coming from China or a classic coming from Japan does not eradicate the fact that most of these works were written by the perspectives of misogynistic men who benefited of the patriarchy and often then more often than not wrote books on how from the lens of a man in that point of time, right? The second thing that opposition comes out and contends is that they tell us that one of the reasons and justifications as to why contemporary works should be then excluded from English classes is because they do not have the sufficient literary devices and therefore do not work as great tools in education. First of all, I think they need to then prove to us the intrinsic value of being to analyze such obscure sentences and such obscure literary devices when more often than not right now, like essays in the modern education system that you see do not really require you to use a lot of literary devices, but rather they require you to be factually correct and to be able to reiterate your words in a very cogent, very logical manner, right? We think that if they're unable to prove that, then this does not justify them to exclude contemporary works out of English classes, right? But the second thing is, even if we engage in the fact that literary devices are important in the entire course of a student's lifetime, we think that these sort of literary devices that are used in classics are literary devices of the past. We think that these sort of metaphors and these sort of juxtapositions that you see in classics are things that describe events back in the past, and how more often than not these literary devices cannot then be used to be applied in the same context, right? We think that these sort of literary devices you will be likely to see in classics are metaphors on how like women are often weak, how they play like the role of being a housewife, how black people were enslaved in the past. We think these are all the sort of examples that you will then see, the metaphors that are used to describe them. We think can be extremely harmful when you apply them towards children who are still forming their own worldview and are still growing up within society, right? We think of how this looks like on how The Merchant in Venice is a book that is based primarily on like anti-Jewish views. We think it's sort of metaphors that you are then going to be exposed in those books are not necessarily literary devices that you can then use to apply in contexts and in like these sort of context right now. The third thing that I want to then talk about is how opposition then just dismisses and conveniently does not want to engage in our framework and our biggest benefit that we are able to provide this sort of representation and empowerment towards students in our timeline. Because understand that the only time more more children in the 21st century read is when they're forced to complete set assignments or have to read certain excerpts from like English class, right? We think that is the only time when they're exposed to actually reading such books and reading such long paragraphs of works, right? We think then it is the best time to expose children to contemporary works from a diverse selection of authors that are included in today's like contemporary work selection. Authors such as Kazuo Ishiguro and Khaled Hosseini, because we think that these are the authors that are not included in the classic literary canon, because most of the authors back then were more often than not men who were already in privileged positions in society, who had the privilege to have education, therefore only wrote works from their own perspective. We think this empowerment is uniquely beneficial. You can only get it on our side of the house, because empowerment is extremely important when you're able to then allow the African American child in your education system feel represented by his own education system, right? We think then when you allow this African American kid to read about the novel of all the hate that you have received and things like that, we think that when they are able to resonate with the sort of microaggressions that they feel, it is something that's incredibly empowering, incredibly beneficial towards these children. I think then that also the sort of representation that you get in contemporary works also is important, because it brings light to these sort of social issues. We think that these sort of books that you're likely to read in our side of the house are books like The Kite Runner, of how like it depicts the entire Afghanistan war and like the conflicts that are happening in the world right now, or about how like A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara on like self-harm and mental issues, on how like adolescents today are so deeply affected by mental issues and how there's often a stigma against that. We think that the only time when you make such topics relevant, make such topics no longer a social taboo, is when you bring it into a system and into a scenario where students are like exposed to it on a daily basis. And because of all those reasons, we're incredibly proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that speech. Now I call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
George, am I audible?
Yeah, ready when you are.
English classes for the average high school students needs to be about the academic skills such as literary analysis, such as critical thinking, such as the ability to analyze themes and comprehend deeper meaning. Classics are the best way to teach these skills, while contemporary works do not do so. We're extremely proud to oppose. Judge, I'll be doing two things in my speech today. Firstly, providing rebuttals onto the four main claims in which proposition team brings to us in today's debate, and then providing an extension that provides analysis as to why classical works will be more economically viable and also principally justifiable. Firstly, let's talk about the rebuttals and the four claims which proposition team brings to us in today's debate. Their first idea, which was brought up by their first speaker, is that classics will stay in relevance because there are people who will still appreciate them. I don't think proposition team can automatically assert that classics that have a great cultural meaning to humankind and society as a whole will remain in relevance automatically. The methods in which they have identified, i.e. museums and book clubs, rely on the continuous support of the population. What occurs when you do not teach these works inside of the education system? You get less individuals becoming passionate inside classics, you get less individuals majoring in English. And the impacts are twofold. Number one, not only are these classics more likely to be forgotten about, there'll be less people funding these museums and participating inside these book clubs. Proposition team has to defend a certain amount of cultural loss on their side of the house. And secondly, you get less proper English works overall because less individuals become passionate inside of the literary analysis of English, and they write less great works, be less cultural loss overall, because less people are just less interested into writing great pieces of literary. Now, moving to their second claim which they provided, which is that English classes need to focus on the use of English language, on technical skills like into literary analysis and literary devices. Firstly, when students enter into a high school English class, especially if they're from a country that has been predominantly English, they have a certain level of English proficiency, which is already enough to carry them throughout the rest of their life. I don't think that average student needs to write an analytical essay for the majority of their jobs. But the thing is that what English lessons teach is they teach a higher level of English than what is actually necessary. They teach college level and level of English that needs to be for individual to major in English and major in the literary devices. An individual who wants to become a businessman doesn't need to know complex English or even high school level English to write emails to his boss. I think it's a core fact that proposition team has to prove is why English classes aren't supposed to teach literary devices and high levels of English. I think Barron sufficiently proved why classics are far better at doing so, and I'll talk about this later in my reconstruction of our speeches. Now, secondly, they say that English classes are discriminatory and lack representation. But before I move on, I'll take the POI since proposition team seems very into self-giving.
Yeah, so you mentioned that a lot of contemporary books right now do not have the potential to be included within the curriculum, but understand that a lot of them have already won Pulitzer Prizes. How does that then make their value any less of classics of the past?
I think this is just a comparative thing, right? Because when you have, especially in the motion directly states, popular contemporary works, oftentimes, as Barron stated before, they're for entertainment purposes and they're popular because they're entertainment. Not only that, we just think that classics on an average level have a higher level of English and complexity and literary analysis ability just because of the fact that they have survived and continue to be popular over multiple generations, while contemporary works are often new. We think that just because of the fact that they've survived for so long, that the general level of English will be higher. Not to say that there's no literary devices in Harry Potter, but we can say that it's definitely comparatively less compared to The Great Gatsby or the works of Ernest Hemingway. Now let's talk about why their claim that English classes are discriminatory and lack representation for all minorities. I think 3 responses here. Judge, I don't think proposition team is being entirely realistic. We are teaching high school students, and these individuals are rational beings who already have most of their worldviews constructed already. Reading a single passage about a racist classic will not cause an individual to become racist or sexist, especially if you mandate inside the education system that these classics and these teachers need to talk about why these classics do not accurately represent the world as a whole. Secondly, I don't think it's completely that all classics have extremely racist or extremely anti-Semitic technology. We believe the opposition team, we have the fiat to say that we're able to remove the extremely racist classics while keeping some better works of Shakespeare that are just slightly less. We think that this mitigates the majority of their benefits. And lastly, I just think that contemporary works as a whole aren't completely void of racism inside of their literary devices. When you see books like Harry Potter being one of the most popular book series in the world, being completely white, being completely Christian, we don't think that this actually represents the social and minorities inside of the UK as a whole or the world as a whole. We see that contemporary works are just as likely to be racist as classical works. We don't see why this is comparative on their side of the house. If a student can read Harry Potter without getting offended, we think at this point classics still have a place in our classrooms. Now, moving on to our extension as to why classics are significantly cheaper than contemporary works and why this is important. Judge, it is important to note that the status quo's education department has an actively fixed budget. That increasing funding to the English department results in cuts elsewhere. Even if proposition says they'll increase the education department's funding, a certain amount of funding still needs to be redirected from other departments or taxes need to be raised as a whole. Taking that into consideration, one major distinction between the classical works and contemporary works, aside from the content which Barron spent the majority of his speech on, is that the fact that classical works have expired copyrights while contemporary works do not. That is to say that classics from Shakespeare or Ernest Hemingway may be free for public schools to purchase compared to contemporary works such as Harry Potter that may cost $10 to $20. When there are millions of high school students, these costs add up. I think that the impact of the extension is twofold. Firstly, on a practical level, and secondly, on a principle level. On a pragmatic, practical level, the proposition team is unnecessarily putting an additional burden on the education system. When schools, even in developed countries, have overcrowded classrooms and underpaid teachers, it cannot be allowed to waste additional funding, even if you buy the minuscule benefit from proposition bench. Secondly, on the principal value, opposition bench does not believe that authors who are often millionaires or even billionaires in the case of J.K. Rowling should be actively benefiting and profiting off the education system. We think, and this as a whole is two reasons as to why, even if you buy their stuff about how contemporary works may sometimes be slightly better than classical works, in the sense that you get less racist dogma, I think that just the fact that education systems in the status quo are underfunded and that you don't get this massive increase in funding is why we stand on opposition team, even if you don't buy into the benefits that Barron talked about in today's debate. Now let me do some weighing in today's role. What has proposition team brought to us here? They gave us three ideas, which is that it is discriminatory, it is discriminatory, these classics do not relate to these students individually, and lastly, as like a certain amount of waste of time. Compare this with the arguments that Barron had brought up. Barron has told you exclusively why classics have a higher level of literary analysis, you're getting better students on our side of the house. Barron also told you why you're wasting time when you're teaching works that have already been taught. We have heard no response from this from the opposition second speaker. And the key thing to point you to is that what we are arguing on opposition side of the house is that proposition side of the house has far less effective teachers, you get worse students overall. But even if you don't buy that contemporary works will be that much worse in quality compared to contemporary classical works, we still bring to you an additional impact here, which is that you're unnecessarily costing the education department millions of dollars. And not only that, you're allowing authors like J.K. Rowling, who is actively anti LGBTQ community, to gain millions and millions of dollars of profit off schools buying expensively and overpriced goods. We think on those two metrics alone, we have a proposition team has already won today's debate.
Okay, I thank the DLO for that speech. Now I call upon the government whip. Here.
Hi, can you hear me clearly? Okay, great. Is the side of opposition just against what?
Oh, I was just saying ready when you are, but yeah, just go ahead. I'll restart the time.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Is the side of opposition just against any improvement to education reform because it costs money? We think by virtue of prop fiat, when the debate assumes you could transition to a modern linguistic literature as opposed to classics, an entire argument centering around how it's expensive, how teachers are unable to adapt, literally falls in this debate. Number one, this falls under the technicality. So if we had the resources to implement this everywhere, would you? Because then you have nothing to stand upon. Also, accessibility is far better on the side. Firstly, because we have prop fiat, which means we don't even have to prove this. But even if I did, we have multiple things such as ebooks being more popularized, public libraries, for example, printed synopsis that teachers can provide if the entirety of the book is really too expensive to purchase. But I'll engage with the largest content that came out from the side of opposition, which is that academic integrity and better students being produced. We told you, and I'll engage with this in multiple forms. Before that, I have several levels of rebuttals for them. The side of opposition immediately fails when they wanted to put us in a box surrounding only modern fiction, such as the info site, such as Harry Potter. We told you it extends far from this. We will extend to Pulitzer Prize winners, Nobel literature winners. We have literal books such as Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom on the outlook of literally life, from Khalid Hosseini on the Thousand Splendid Suns, on the life of a Pakistani woman under a system of oppression, or I Am Malala, a biography of oppression and how she had to go through such immense trauma in order to achieve education reforms for women within her country. It never extended to just this. For them to claim and for them to destroy our argument merely by saying English currently is to teach things such as literary devices, for you to be more proficient in the English language. We think that is exactly what we contest. We think English as a language should evolve. And notice how this does not necessarily come at the expense of English proficiency. Number one, you still literally have grammar classes on top of your literary classes, like English like classes that alternate between your days. But number two, it's disingenuous to just disregard the literary value that modern day literature holds. For you to just assume that you don't have the same literary power that a Shakespeare classic has. What is it missing then? Is it missing foreshadowing? Is it missing dark and light archetypes that are represented within books? Is it lacking character diversity? Is it lacking moral ambiguity? Is it lacking all of these sorts of things? We tell you that on the side of proposition, it is no. So for them to just assume these sorts of things don't exist, and for them to then claim the benefit of better education and better educated students, they cannot win this claim. We told you how it's important for English as a language, especially to the lens of stories or lens of books, in order to introduce new ideas and new ways of thinking and expression for individuals. For them, or the side of proposition, to then denote that it is invalid because modern works of literature are made for entertainment. The only question I have for them was, did Shakespeare make Macbeth? Did Shakespeare make Hamlet for the purpose of educating the mass public on how to use English properly, or was it also a form of entertainment in order to express his feelings of the society in the Victorian era? Because if that's the moral basis of your argument, you would then not be in support of classics, because the only reason we praise the literary works now and literary devices is because of centuries worth of preservation that we think is unnecessary and kept within society. But then secondly, why do they ultimately fail in even proving their benefits from materializing? They can't get away with vague language talking about how we teach them better English, because what is this better English that you're learning? Number one, we took away literary devices, because these are things that are very prevalent within modern day works of literature as well, and does not only extend to YA fiction books that only exist for 13 or teenagers in and of itself. But what is the level of language, and is it even relevant even if it's true? So why is learning Old English and Victorian age English present and relevant in the society today for my English standard? Why is learning how to use words such as thou, or having like weird inverted commas everywhere, or having all these sorts of weird ideas and weird ways to write certain words, why is it relevant now? We told you why all these sorts of classics are adapted in the modern day society. That is why the level of English and the way in which we express ourselves in the form of English as a language has evolved past that era. Because if that was truly the peak and the pinnacle of the English language, we wouldn't have evolved past that. We wouldn't have changed the ways in which we converse and the ways in which we diversify and express ourselves then. We've adopted all the aspects of classic modern literature and adapted it into a setting in the modern century in the first place. So therefore, what does proposition actually have to bring to the debate? Number one, the entire idea that you're unable to do this is unfeasible just falls apart on all premises. Because even if teachers couldn't adapt now, that's not to say that they can't. First of all, that like it's intellectually dishonest, because teachers are able to study material. You literally have new syllabus and new textbooks that are introduced like every decade, or syllabus changes. Our teachers unable to do that. But number two, even your classics started off as things teachers did not comprehend to its fullest extent. What argument are you bringing then? Secondly, on the idea of producing better students, number one, we heard no claims on the magnitude as to why any of my in-depth analysis into whether or not I can depict certain lines of like ambiguous text is relevant in the modern day society for students to progress and for the working environment. And number two, the vagueness of me having to explain what these things look like for you is an extension of their analysis that they never brought to you. For them to just say that, oh, individuals want to pursue things like English majors, I want to pursue a cooking major, the education system literally does not provide for me as well. We think individuals that truly want to go into really niche fields of work within the world pursue things like extra classes. You join like the literary club, you go for the old book clubs within your public libraries to learn about these sorts of things. You can't just denote that as your entire argument. But the large basis on the case of opposition is left uncontended with how this shapes social views, how this is impactful for the reader, and how you instill a sense of empathy and morality within them that is unchallenged on the side of proposition. When we told you all of these sorts of modern literatures that we would be happy to include that extends far beyond just the bounds of the fiction category, we told you why this is far more beneficial for individuals on the ground, or students in general. Because even if language currently is to teach you how to speak the current language. We think it should then evolve because language is used in every aspect of society, every facet of how we identify, how we express ourselves, how we even describe ourselves is used through the English language and through that medium. We think it's best done under this model. And they also have to understand that they never wanted to engage with how we told you diversity only exists within modern works of literature, or even if it does exist on the classics in their best case scenario, it is far more prevalent because of the socially conscious society that we have today. How many authors are called out because they lack diversity, when their characters are whitewashed, when individuals all fit the normal beauty standards in the first place? We think for them to just disregard all the amazing and beautiful language that is used within modern day literature is disingenuous. We claim all of their benefits on top of the modernization and the relatability of the 21st century that is relevant for students today. But then also note that a lot of the literature works propagate a lot of harmful stereotypes that exist. And notice how you're not able to add a disclaimer or contextualize what it should mean or what you should interpret it as, because English as a language was meant for the individual to interpret themselves and what meaning they derive from it. So things like Romeo and Juliet, prioritizing love to the expense where you would die for that individual. Things like Pride and Prejudice and Wuthering Heights that glorify toxicity within relationships and say it's okay, and these are the processes within a normal relationship that exist. These are problematic norms that you have to contend with. You can't just say individuals have a moral compass. When you're 12 to 13, what moral compass is there that is formed? You're still malleable. You're still shaped by what you learn within school. Side with opposition.
Okay, I thank the government whip for that speech. Now I call upon the opposition whip here.
Hello, am I audible? Okay.
When you are.
Thank you. The difference in this debate is very clear. On both sides of the house, people read the most popular contemporary works in and outside of school. The prime factor and difference that has already won opposition to this debate is that they fail to engage on the very fact that people have already read these contemporary works outside of school, and on our side of the house, we use this class time to enrich the students' English knowledge and analytical skills with classics, because students clearly learn more in the English classroom on our side, and there's still no response to this. After 24 minutes of talking for proposition, we have already won this round on side opposition. Before I move on to two main questions to analyze this debate, four main general issues I have with the proposition case. Firstly, they tell you on Prop 1 that students will be extremely bored of the content on our side of the house. They completely dropped this after the first speech, but I'll touch on that anyway. I think that if they want to cave into whatever the students think is boring, I just don't see why they would not teach basic math instead of calculus in 11th grade, because the vast majority of students think that complex math such as calculus is also very boring and very difficult. The fact of the matter is, things that the student doesn't think is boring, for example, if a student really likes science, is also when that student is going to go out of his or her way to sign up for an online chemistry class. What that means is that you have to push students to learn what they don't want to do at their own benefit. Students are inherently short-sighted. This is something proposition does not seem to understand. I would say pushing students to do something they don't want to do is an inherent benefit. Secondly, they base the premise of their case of inclusivity and how contemporary works essentially integrates that, right? We agree. We told you that contemporary works are contemporary for a reason. We think that the absolute vast majority of people have read Harry Potter. However, they have not read Shakespeare. They have not read the script of Romeo and Juliet, etc. I think Barron's analysis was pretty clear, right? But we also told you that even in the best case, inclusivity does not matter at all. It does not matter if you don't feel intimate connection with Shakespeare. It furthers the analytical skills of an English student. Note the purpose of an English class, which is to lead you to English career in college, etc. This fails on side proposition. No, thank you. How do we want people to read books, right? They say that, look, they want people reading a book to be connected to the scope of the book and the background of the author and essentially how it connects to society. They tell you that when you read books and analyze the background of the author, you change your view of society. But notice two things, right? They completely ignore that the purpose of an English class is to derive the literary essence of the books, nothing more. But social studies class, amongst other classes, is better at doing what they're doing as well. When you directly focus on things like women's rights or past history, I think that's a much better set curriculum to learn about the things that they're trying to integrate in English class, right? But second, people are also rational, so they won't derive war and bad values, no thank you, from decades and centuries ago. Two families will not go into a full-on battle because they read Romeo and Juliet. I just don't think this is rational. The fourth and final problem I have with the proposition case today is they tell you that this motion is not limited to modern novels like Harry Potter. They also want to engage on Nobel Peace Prize winners and other things like that, right? We would say that when you're teaching like Malala in English class, that is still a waste of time because these speeches and books that she has made and created is even less of a literary essence compared to Harry Potter. You learn these same values of feminism that you would teach, that they want to teach on proposition in A push in social studies. They lose on all of the grounds they want to provide on side proposition. Two main questions I have to analyze this thing. Firstly, on the idea of who betters the students of an English class. There's three things here. Firstly, I think they have already lost the clash by far when Prop 1 comes up and tells you how the English class has to revolve around contemporary issues. I think Barron also did a very good job refuting this. But furthermore, the thing is, for example, if you live in Hong Kong, you probably know the issues that are going on in the status quo. You can see the benefits of the current society and the drawbacks of that current society as well. This is very accessible. However, the implications of Romeo and Juliet are rather obscure and not something that the average person can access while walking around the streets. That's the very purpose of English class, to delve way past the common societal issues that they don't want to talk about on proposition side in this debate. Secondly, when they tell you about how there's not much to, like, for example, an old Scottish king fighting ghosts, but what they don't acknowledge is that this can mean many things, right? These ghosts can mean inner regrets, and him being a king can represent him having his selfish actions and behaviors. There's much more to learn from classics, as the English is often used very different from the English we speak today, prompting students to write deeper essays, longer essays, not now, and spend more time on rereading these works. Thirdly, what Prop 2 comes up and tells you is they want to prioritize literary devices that we would use in the status quo instead of these literary devices that we push on our side that are much more classical. No contradiction here, right? Because they say that English classes should be revolved around social values and essentially things that you would experience in society. But then why would they care about modern literary devices in the first place, right? Their stance simply does not line up on side proposition. But I would say that the fact that these classics have been in circulation for centuries and centuries means that the literary devices are probably better than those used in Fahrenheit 451. But once again, they neglect the fact that the vast majority of people has read Fahrenheit 451 already compared to, for example, a Shakespeare poem, right? After three speeches, we still hear no engagement on this cost-benefit analysis that we told you in our first two speeches on how you're essentially wasting time in the English classroom. This time to be using to enrich a student's knowledge, his analytical skills. Before I move on to the second flashpoint, I'll take your view on.
Literature on the side of proposition is not a book discussion class. You will still analyze these sorts of things. We still derive your benefit. Even in the trade-off, please explain why that magnitude is anywhere important in modern society.
Okay, so there's two things, right? Firstly, you contradict yourself again because your whole stance essentially you should be focused on societal values. On your side, when you still have discussions, I think you violate that very principle that you want to talk about, right? But secondly, I would say when you do a book discussion regarding Harry Potter and you compare it to our side, when you do a book discussion regarding, for example, a Shakespeare poem, in that sense, I would say you have a much deeper understanding and a much deeper discussion that's able to derive much more value out of that discussion. I just think that in every single way, we win on the literacy analysis part, and why we have better students at English. Secondly, on the moral principle, right? They want to talk about racism on our side of the house, as all these classics are written by the dominant white racist men, right? I think there's two main layers, right? Even if even if the things you get from the contemporary works is better, we still get them for the children on our side, as they'll still read them outside of school. But secondly, they don't show you why the contemporary works are any better. Clement told you why all three of the main characters in Harry Potter are white. There's literally virtually no other minorities like African Americans that play a role in the book at all. We think that on the idea of sexism and racism, it is not as bad as they make it seem on our side. Compared to me, it's much worse, right? But engaging on the metric, we think that at the end of the day, it is still the government selecting the works to be taught in the curriculum. I would say if the government has selected a non-racist contemporary work, I just don't see why they can't select a non-racist classical work as well. This racist works just doesn't exist on our side of the house, right? At the end of the day, on side of opposition, we made on two main grounds in today's debate. Firstly, we've shown you exactly why we have better English students on the idea, as well as the idea on the moral principle. In addition, we told you why it's okay to push a student to do what he or she thinks is boring and is too challenging, because that essentially provides them more options in the future to choose from. Furthermore, we also told you, more importantly, on how inclusivity does not matter at all, and the purpose of the English class is to learn about literary analysis and not to learn about social issues. That is something learned in other classes. For these reasons above, we're very, very proud to oppose.
Hi, can I begin?
Sure, go for it.
You. Okay. I think there's two extremely important clashes in today's debate, and if I'm able to prove to you why we win on both of them, I think we take today's debate as a whole. And those two clashes is, firstly, the importance of learning about these literary devices and the importance of learning about literature, and secondly, the clash about the contention of asking why like history classes and social classes can't fulfill their own burden. But before that, I think it's pretty funny that government tries to push that the literary devices in Harry Potter is somehow better than that in Shakespeare. I've already explained to you through 2 points why it's extremely better on the literary scale, being the incentive of these authors and the test of history on them. I don't really think that point's relevant in today's debate. But then moving on to two most important clashes, right? Which is that firstly, the important clash about a contention of asking why can't history classes and social study classes fulfill their burden? We get no response whatsoever from government's side, other than a mere one-liner. Oh, you could get a specific scope of the author from these literary texts. But notice that this scope is still not important because you can get so many viewpoints from just studying history and studying society through social studies classes, which exact purpose of being there is for you to learn about society today. Their entire benefits fall when they're unable to prove why English class achieves this view of society exclusively. We tell you that Asian history classes or classes such as social studies is able to give you these viewpoints as well. Their case for English is not exclusive. But then on the comparative, what do we tell you? We tell you, however, that on the comparative, what English class specifically has and uniquely teaches that only English class has and not Asian history or like social studies is that they could teach literary devices. So we win this characterization on the purpose of English class by giving you one aspect of English that is actually exclusive to all other classes in the education system, being actually analyzing and learning about the literary techniques and literary devices in these classics. We win the characterization clash. But then secondly, on the most important clash, it's the purpose of being able to analyze text and use literary devices. And notice that this is the main push the government is giving to our arguments. But however, there are many arguments that we explain down throughout the bench. I'm pretty confused as to why they still try to continue to push this, right? Being that firstly, we tell you that colleges need you to have this. If you want to go to Harvard, you will obviously need to be able to study and analyze Shakespeare works. There are still going to be tests regarding English and your English devices you need to take in order to get to college. So if not for anything else, you're learning this for your own future. You would obviously seem better for a college if you study Shakespeare rather than Harry Potter because of its higher level. This is the first reason why you would study literary devices. But then the second reason, this is the most important reason, is that we give students a choice. Because you studying literary devices is just like you studying math and calculus. You study calculus not because you might need it in the future, but because it provides you an option to actually go into a mathematics career in the future. Studying these literary devices is what enables you to give you an option for your career and for your job in the future. If they want to defend the fact that English and literary devices isn't important, I think they'll also be pretty happy to defend how calculus and math isn't important in society as well. I think their case falls on that. But then thirdly, people are also better able to produce works because they study this. Because notice that will prove to you why these classics have more literary value, so people are actually going to be better at writing if they study better literary devices. But then fourthly, they're also the basis of literature. So it's extremely important for you to study the origin. It's like studying history, except you're studying in the form of literature. You get a sense of when these literatures and these devices became created. For those four reasons, I think we reasonably proved to you why literary devices is extremely important for society today. But what they bring us is that they say these contemporary writings are more usable and applicable in society. But notice that devices used in like Harry Potter, for example, metaphors, is already learned in like middle school and elementary schools. But outside of like, these curriculums specifically for these books, there's also lessons teaching about devices like metaphors. I think that it falls as well. But then two arguments that they have no response to is that firstly, the response to arguments about teachers having better teaching students staying at the same level, no response to that. Secondly, my partner Clement's moral extension about how it's not fair for these authors to make money off the educational system, no response to this as well. But then lastly, on their push about like societal views, contemporary works are read by a lot of people outside the school curriculum anyways, so their views and society will still be fit to that. I think we take down the majority of the case by proving to you why we win on every single clash. I think we clearly take this debate extremely proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, I think the opposition whip for that, opposition reply for that speech, and now I call upon the government reply here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
To downgrade works like Malala Yousafzai, calling them a waste of time, saying that reforming education is expensive, cannot be the basis for opposition to win this debate. I'm going to address two clashes that happened today. First of all, on the efficacy of contemporary works as a tool of education, and second of all, on how diversity can only uniquely come from contemporary works and why that is so important. Understand that under the claim of efficacy of classics as a tool for education, they claim that contemporary works do not have the sufficient proficiency and value of things like literary devices and will therefore undermine and affect the overall quality of students that are produced from said English class. First of all, we've already responded to this because we've told you that more often than not, contemporary works are built on the foundations of classics. That is to say that the literary devices would have been adapted and rewritten in contemporary ways that far better encompass the contexts that are much more applicable and much more relevant in today's society. We think then that the issues that are also highlighted in contemporary works are also much more applicable and are much more useful for students nowadays. Understand that the very justification that they say that contemporary works do not have, I quote, a higher level as compared to classics is because of the fact that the outwit tells you that the classics have persevered for so long and therefore they should be more valuable. We question the very logical analysis of that because they failed to prove to us how the inherent value of 15th century old English and how it's still applicable to a science-driven modern world today that requires you to write in logical-driven essays with cogent writing. We don't understand why a computer student or an engineering student needs the sort of literary devices that they talk about to write about the sort of essays that they need to persuade the masses, right? We think then that the very reason why contemporary works nowadays are also awarded prizes like Pulitzer Prizes, are voted as bestsellers in like bookstores, is also reaffirms the fact that these works do have an inherent value and are able to also reach the sort of like literary proficiency that opposition wants to contend. Because who are they to say that such contemporary works fall behind the works of Shakespeare and Ernest Hemingway and Edgar Allan Poe, right? We do not understand the very basis for their accusation. The third thing that they then say is that, oh, analysis building is then undermined when you can't analyze contemporary works. But we think that this is very, very weird justification because we've already told you that contemporary works also have like hidden meanings where you also need to then analyze the story or perhaps analyze the sort of like viewpoint that the author wants to talk about. We don't think classics are the only thing where you can place these sort of things on, right? We think then that the overall clash that comes from this is that language should evolve, and we think that the proficiency is not compromised on our side of the house when we've already told you how things such as grammar and comprehension lessons can also be applied hand in hand together whilst teaching contemporary works, right? The second issue is then on like the diversification that can only come from contemporary works. They tell you that the contemporary works will be racist and they will then be able to exclude certain classic books that are then racist. We think then that their counter proposal on how we can then get social issues from history classes is not extremely exclusive because we can also then flip around and ask you, why don't we just learn Victorian day English and like Shakespeare works and Edgar Allan Poe in history classes, right? Because they literally are history anyways, right? We think it works both ways. But we think then that it's not as simple for them to claim that classics are then racist and homophobic and they can then be excluded when they want to, right? We think that the very basis of you opting to choose classics over contemporary works means you exclude the whole range of contemporary selections that are out there, because understand that contemporary works are more often not more inclusive. That is to say, you have more inclusive works to talk about, right? Understand that the only example that they were willing to engage on was on how they kept on talking about Harry Potter when we've given you examples like The Kite Runner, right, that talks about issues of Afghanistan, or we talk about the 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Houdini that talks about current issues of the oppression of women in Pakistan, or Malala Yousafzai books and her attempt of education reform. We think it's extremely incredibly dismissive of them to claim that such issues are a waste of time, and it's extremely important in shaping the world point and the worldview that eventually garners the sort of social awareness. For all those reasons, we are proud to propose.
Okay, I think the government reply for that speech. I'll need a couple of minutes to deliberate and then I'll give you the call.